It's an honor to speak with you today at the 30th anniversary of USP's SIBi. I'd like to, in particular, thank Professor Ferreira for this opportunity. I had the privilege last year to speak by video link at the discussion forum on open access here at USP. And at that meeting, I spoke about a set of policies and projects that we've been working on at Harvard towards broader dissemination of our research, and in particular of the scholarly articles that are the primary mode of expressing those results. So, since I talked about those activities last year, I thought in this talk I want to concentrate not on those past activities, but on the possible future of open access, and in particular, whether such a future is possible at all. Now, before I start my talk, I want to mention that my talk has a mascot, and that mascot is the bumblebee. I was told last night at dinner that the Portuguese word is jangão, not jangão. I apologize for my pronunciation, and I promise not to say the word in Portuguese again. So you'll see why when I come back to the bumblebee later at the end of the talk. But the subject of my talk is open access publishing of scholarly journals, by which I mean to refer to journals that work in every way the same as traditional journals, except that they don't charge any fees for electronic access to the scholar-contributed content. Now, some people say that publishing journals this way, open access journals, is a pipe dream. It's founded on economic naivete, and that an open access future is impossible. I'll give you some examples of this view in a moment. It's important to understand the basis for this view, so I'll go through various arguments of this sort, but I will argue that on the contrary, open access journal publishing is actually preferable, not only on access grounds, that's clear and that's been the subject of the previous talks. Of course, broader access is always preferable to more narrow access, but on economic grounds as well. Now, I should mention that those who think open access publishing is problematic have their preferred alternative, namely publishing just how it's always been done for the last few decades. They say that everything is fine as it is. I'm depicting here, you can imagine a little conversation between a publisher of a traditional journal on the left and someone else, me perhaps, on the right. So they say everything is fine as it is, and you can see this view. I'll give you a few quotes. Here, for instance, is the view of Dirk Hank, the CEO of Springer. He says, "I don't believe that our pricing is a big problem, and I'm sure that this market can carry on indefinitely. I accept that there was once a problem, but today we can't give libraries access to any more journals because they already have access to all they could ever want." So that was his view earlier this year. Here's a view from Kent Anderson, the CEO and publisher of the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, concerning whether the large profits that commercial publishers are making is problematic. And his view is that the prices paid by institutions and individuals are shared ultimately by the for-profit publisher. They're shared with nonprofit organizations, with the authors of books and monographs. I don't know how that's pertinent to journals. And in most cases, with shareholders. And some of the shareholders are academics. So this should all be fine. And these corporations also pay taxes, they're taxpayers, so it's important that they be benefited as well by this publicly funded research. That's the implication. And then with regards to questions about whether subscription access is based on a monopoly, he says, no, there are hundreds of publishers in the market. There is no monopoly, period. So you can see this view that everything is fine as it is now. So maybe I should just take a minute or two to provide a little bit of counter-evidence that things are not actually completely fine. Although, as I say, that's not the main point of my talk. But just to give you a little bit of evidence of that sort. I'll just talk about a couple of bits of empirical evidence of problems in the market for scholarly journals. The first is large and sustained disparities in prices. You find huge disparities between different journals of the prices that they charge. Here, on this slide, just shows disparities between commercial and nonprofit journals in a range of fields, and you see the differences on the left in price per page are a factor of about 6 to 1, commercial journals being 6 times more expensive than nonprofit journals. If we try to compensate for quality by measuring price not per page, but price per citation for these fields, it turns out that the disparity is even greater, something like a factor of 16 to 1. So there's a nice summary of this situation by Andrew Lisko, who says, many publishers argue that costs cannot be reduced much, even with electronic publishing, since most of the cost is the first copy cost of preparing the manuscripts for publication. This argument is refuted by the widely differing costs among publishers, which is what we see on this slide, of course. So these huge price differentials are clear empirical evidence of a dysfunctional market. And here's another piece of evidence, well known perhaps to you all, at least those who are involved in purchasing of serials. It's the persistent, steady hyperinflation in journal prices over the last few decades. I don't have to belabor that point. So everything is not fine as it is now. There's clear evidence of market failure in the scholarly journal publishing market. Huge price disparities, persistent hyperinflation, excessive rents, spirals of cancellation, and the resulting decreased access. And of course, that's the most important problem, is the decreased access. Ideally, we want as much access as possible, and preferably open access. So open access would be better. And there would be an obvious, let's say it's not just me who thinks that open access would be better. Many people have this feeling. In fact, there's a nice study that was done in 2010, the study of open access publishing, a study of attitudes about open access based on a very large survey of researchers showing that, here's some results from that study, showing that the vast majority of academics think that their research field would benefit from open access journals. So all things being equal, open access is preferred to closed access, and of course there's a natural model for this open access. That's the open access journal, and let me just remind you what an open access journal is. Open access journals work exactly like traditional subscription-based journals with only one difference. And that difference is they don't charge for electronic access to scholar-contributed content. That's it. Other than that, they work exactly like traditional journals. But they don't charge, as traditional journals do, for electronic access to scholar-contributed content. So all things being equal, open access is preferred to closed access, but a reaction to that is this: free journals, comes the reply. Free journals are an illusion. Publishing isn't free. Open access publishing violates the prime law of economics, which holds that you can't get something for nothing. So let's see some examples of that view. Here's a quote, just a few quotes pulled from various writers. Free publishing may seem a nice idea, but the recent experience of BMJ should remind us that nothing is really free. Here's another one. Open access isn't free. That's what my first year econ student will tell you. I don't know why scientists can't get that. Here's a quote from Alan Adler, the vice president of the American Association of Publishers. He says, this is all very easy to explain. They, meaning librarians, they are looking to obtain for free what they now obtain through subscription. It's very short-sighted. So you can see that these people think that all this talk about eliminating subscription fees is economically naive. It's crazy talk. Where will all the money come from to pay for the valuable services that publishers provide? So I'm here to tell you, no, we aren't naive. We don't think that publishing is free. Open access journals, I'll remind you, avoid only one particular revenue stream, namely charging for online access to scholar-contributed content. But they can get revenue in other ways. For instance, they could charge for non-scholar-contributed content. There are some journals where a huge portion of the content is not scholar-contributed. It's contributed by writing staffs that the journal runs. It's contributed by its commission, reviews, or other kinds of writings. They could charge for print access to the content. That's certainly fine. Most importantly, however, and the revenue model I want to emphasize in this talk is they can charge for publishing scholar-contributed content. Not, again, for providing online access to the content, but for the publishing of the content. That is, they can charge publication fees. Now, there's a final, also quite important type of support that open access journals can use, and I don't want to minimize it, and that is subventions, support from institutions that support the mission of the journal, universities, funding agencies, foundations, directly underwriting the activities of the journal. I think that's also very important. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to concentrate on this publication fee revenue model because it's the most market-oriented revenue model. So yes, publishing isn't free, but the response might be that yes, it isn't free, but author-side fees, publication fees can pay. Now, the reaction might be that authors won't pay fees. At least they don't want to pay fees. Now here we see a real objection. It's true that with the exception of just a few fields, in particular the life sciences, where authors are used to pay publication fees, even for subscription journals, authors are not willing to pay publication fees. And furthermore, they can't really be forced to pay publication fees since they can always choose to publish in a closed access journal, a subscription journal that doesn't charge publication fees. In most fields, that's the norm. And we can see the effect of this in, again, from some data from this same SOAP study. Authors were asked how many open access articles they had published in the last few years and how many subscription journal articles they had published. And you can see it's a huge disparity in the distribution. Very few authors are publishing significant numbers of articles open access. About 50% of the respondents published 6 or more articles in the last 5 years, but only 10% have published that many open access articles. So very highly skewed away from open access publishing. And when asked why they're not publishing articles open access, there's a very clear answer. By far the largest reason that these respondents to this study described was funding. That is, they don't want to pay publication fees. Furthermore, essentially all of the other reasons that they gave follow on from that desire not to pay publication fees. For instance, they talk about a lack of journals as the second biggest reason. And there aren't very many open access journals, certainly, especially if we restrict to high quality open access journals, there aren't that many compared to the number of journals overall. And in part that's because publishers aren't willing to move to this open access publication fee model if their authors aren't willing to pay the publication fees. So again, even the problem of finding appropriate journals in turn rests on this problem that authors don't want to pay publication fees. So what can be done about this problem? Well, if you think about the market structure for the typical closed access journal, typical subscription journal, this is how the structure works. There's a publisher, and the publisher's product is access to articles. The publisher makes that product, that access, available to readers. But the publisher is paid not by the readers, but instead by universities and, in turn, by the funding agencies that pay those universities' overheads. So it's the universities and funding agencies of the world that are really underwriting the fees that go to the publisher to pay so the readers can have access. Now, for open access journals, the situation is a little bit different. In general, the universities and the funding agencies don't play a role at all. The publisher is providing now access. The product of an open access publisher is not access, because that's given freely to everyone. The product for which revenues are being derived are the publisher services that the publisher provides to the authors now, not the readers. And in return, the authors are required to pay the publication fee to the publisher. So it's not symmetric with respect to the open access, with respect to the subscription journals. In this case of subscription journals, universities pay on behalf of the readers. And the answer to this problem now seems obvious, since readers don't pay for access in closed access journals, but are instead supported by universities and the funding agencies that underwrite them. Similarly, authors needn't pay for publisher services in open access journals. Instead, publication fees could be paid by the universities and the funding agencies that underwrote the research. So, in a system in which universities and funding agencies would underwrite reasonable open access publication fees, we wouldn't have this problem that the open access journals would be at a disadvantage because authors don't want to pay publication fees. Now, this isn't an original idea to me. It follows from the economics of the situation. And in fact, Roger Knoll, an economist who's studied the economics of scholarly publication, over 15 years ago, pointed out that the best means for accomplishing the objective of encouraging the best social good in scholarly publishing would be subsidization of the fixed cost of publication, that is, the publisher services. That would be, from an economic point of view, the best way to go. So we should all do that. We should all underwrite reasonable open access publication fees. And we've codified that idea in what's called the Open Access Compact. Compact for Open Access Publishing Equity. Here's the operative sentence from that compact. It says, each of the undersigned universities commits to the timely establishment of durable mechanisms for underwriting reasonable publication charges for articles published in fee-based open access journals. So this is the Compact for Open Access Publishing Equity. It initially started with a group of 5 universities. Here they are: Cornell, Dartmouth, Harvard, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and the University of California at Berkeley were the original 5 signatories, and since then several other institutions have joined on as signatories. And there are other universities that, although they're not signatories of the Compact, essentially act as if they are. That is, they have already established policies to underwrite open access publication fees. And fashionable to list Nobel Prize winners who support their cause. So here's a list of the Nobel Prize winners who are supporters of the Compact for Open Access Publishing Equity. Other institutions, including publishers, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, Creative Commons, Spark Europe, and so forth. So there is the worry that authors won't pay fees, but universities and funding agencies can on behalf of the authors, just as we do on behalf of our readers for subscription journals. Well, but then perhaps some universities will end up paying more in publication fees than they're now paying in subscription fees. Suppose, just a thought experiment. Suppose all of the journals became open access journals. So there were no subscription fees to pay anymore, but we had to pay open access publication fees on behalf of the authors. Would some of the universities end up actually paying more than they're now paying? Well, personally, my first reaction is, so what if that's the case? If a few universities pay more, then there's an argument to be made that those universities were getting some kind of special deal before on the backs of all the other universities that would be paying less. Who's to say that the universities shouldn't be paying? They're getting more publisher services from these journals than they're paying for. So maybe they should be paid more. And in addition, in this hypothetical world, where a few universities are paying more, everyone who is within the purview of an internet connection would now have access to all of the articles. So maybe paying a little bit more would be worthwhile. So that's my first reaction, is maybe it's not a problem. But let's actually look at the analysis a little bit. Here's an example of a study that purported to show that in an open access world, some universities would pay more. Here's a quote from it's quite a nice article actually, I recommend it. They actually went through the exercise of estimating prices under 2 open access models, 2 different models of how the charges would go, and they conclude that under at least one of these models, the top universities would pay up to 10 times as much as they currently do. On the other hand, institutions with fewer than around 4 million volumes would be likely to save money under the open access model. First, let me just do a back of the envelope calculation. We can talk about some universities paying more, some universities paying less. What about overall? Overall, would the universities be paying more or less? Well, that we can maybe figure out. The average revenue per article in scholarly publishing overall is $5,000 per article. In aggregate over the entire scholarly journal publishing industry, look at the total revenue divided by the total number of articles that they publish. It's about $5,000 of revenue per article. The most expensive open access journal in the world charges a publication fee of less than $3,000 per article. So even if every open access journal charged as much as the single most expensive journal, we'd be saving 40% of the total cost. So overall, there doesn't seem to be a problem. There seems to be enough money in the system to pay for open access publication fees. But now what about this question about which universities would pay more and which would pay less? Well, here are the two models that the authors of the study looked at. One is called they called it the PLOS stands for Public Library of Science major open access publishing, the PLOS open access model. And in that model, they estimated that every article published would have a publication fee of the highest priced PLOS journal, which is the highest priced journal, open access journal in the world. And that at the time of the study was $2,500. Now it's $2,850. The study was a few years ago. So they assumed that every article would have the cost of the single highest priced journal, open access journal in the world. That's the PLOS open access model. And the other model was the so-called equal revenue open access model. And there they assumed that all of the articles would be priced by the publisher at whatever price would maintain their revenues under the subscription model. So if the publisher was getting on average $2,000 per article in revenue from subscriptions, they would price the publication fee at $2,000. If they were getting $5,000 revenue, they would price it at $5,000. If, as some journals claim, they're getting $10,000 to $30,000 per article, then presumably they would be pricing at $10,000 to $30,000 per article. And presumably, on average, the price would be $5,000 per article, because that is the average revenue per article in the industry as a whole. It's a little bit tricky because they were talking about, the study was only for the life sciences, I should say. It was only for life sciences. So we can't really extrapolate to the industry as a whole. But I would expect that the revenue per article in the life sciences is certainly no lower than the industry average, and probably higher. Okay. So some things to point out. First, PLOS doesn't just publish one journal at $2,500 or $2,850 per article. Their largest journal, which I'll talk about later a bit, a journal called PLOS One, charges only $1,350. So why they picked this number of 2,500 is a little odd. In fact, if you look overall at the average, if you look at the median publication fee, for open access journals, the median publication fee is $0. That is, most open access journals charge no publication fees at all. It's interesting how they can maintain operations, and of course it's based on subventions, so that's the primary means. Okay. So picking this number of 2,500 seems a little excessive. And of course, for the equal revenue open access model, that number is probably somewhere around $5,000. Now, some things to note about these models. Both models assume, furthermore, that the universities are going to pay all of these fees. But why should the universities pay all of the fees? Much of this research, especially in the life sciences where this study was done, are funded by research grants. And there the research grants can and should be paying these fees. In fact, research grants already pay page charges and other kinds of author side fees in the life sciences for authors already. And I would assume funding agencies, as the sources of the research that the articles are based on, as part of their fair share of underwriting the research ecology, should be paying publication fees for the articles that they fund. But this study assumes the universities pay all of the fees. Second of all, they assume that the revenue model, going from subscription revenue to open access as the publication fees as the revenue, that the revenue model has no impact on the structure of the market. So I want to come back to that as well. But even if we look at those, even if we buy these assumptions, let's look at how many universities would pay more under these two models, according to this study. So here are the number of institutions paying more under these two models. under the so-called PLOS open access model, of the 4,221 universities that they looked at, only one university would be paying more. That university is Harvard University. Now, I'm here to tell you, Harvard University is not worried that we'll be paying more in this hypothetical world in which all access is through open access journals. Even under the equal revenue open access model, there were only 10 institutions paying more out of the 4,221. Now, personally, I think that all of these kinds of analyses are really irrelevant because the assumptions are so far off from how things would actually play out. You're imagining such a huge change in how scholarly publishing would work. Switching the revenue model wholesale from subscription fees to publication fees is a completely different market. And so extrapolating that everything else would stay the same, I think is, it just doesn't make any sense. So it's really a kind of game. You can't really extrapolate it at all. Okay. So there's the worry that some universities will end up paying more, but as I say, it depends on the size of the fee. If we look at the range of fees for open access journals at the moment, Public Library of Science PLOS has the highest fees. They range from $1,350 to $2,850. Biomed Central is about in the $1,500 range. Dowie in the $600 to $1,000 range. These are publishers that publish completely open access, but they're run very efficiently, and they generate revenues per article of about these numbers, much less than the industry-wide average of $5,000. Now, that's at the moment, but the skeptic might ask, what's to prevent those fees from hyperinflating? Of course, subscription fees have been hyperinflating for decades. Why not just hyperinflate the publication fees as well? Well, again, yes, if everything were the same, maybe that would happen, but everything is not the same. A market based on the product being access is a different market from the market for publisher services. The market for access is based on selling a monopolistic good. The publisher owns, monopolistically, the rights to provide access to the article. That's what copyright is. If you are the purchaser of this good, namely the libraries, you purchase by buying a subscription to the journal, there is no other journal you could go to purchase the same content. In fact, you want to go to other journals not instead of a given journal, but in addition to a given journal. Journals, when they're selling access, are complements of each other. You want to get them both. But when the market is a market for publisher services, the situation is completely different. Here you're selling the services to the author. The author doesn't want the services from two journals for a single article. For a single article, the author only wants the services from one journal. In fact, authors are not allowed to get the services from two journals. You can only publish an article in one journal. So, from the point of view of the author purchasing publisher services, the market is not a market of complements. It's a market of substitutes. One journal is a substitute for another. You pick the journal based on what value you get for the money. And therefore, the journals would compete for publisher services. And there's only two ways to compete in that market. You can provide better publisher services, or you can provide lower cost publisher services. And either one is fine with me. You know, better services, lower cost services, that's all good. Okay, so what's to prevent fees hyperinflating? Author side fees are a competitive market, as opposed to the current market we're in. And that's why extrapolating to a future where you assume everything else is going to stay the same doesn't make any sense, because we would be moving from a market that we know is dysfunctional, I showed the evidence on the first few slides, to a market where at least we have a chance to have competition and a well-functioning market. Okay, so finally I want to get back to the mascot for the talk, the bumblebee. So let me tell you why I chose this mascot. There's an old story, maybe you've heard this story, that some scientist was studying the physics of flight many years ago, and he performs a very careful study of the bumblebee, the anatomy of the bumblebee, structure of the bumblebee's wings, applies the pertinent mathematics to the situation, solves the equations, and concludes that bumblebees can't fly. Now, just waiting for the translation into Portuguese. Now, the problem is, nobody told the bumblebees. So, maybe you've heard this story. I actually did a bit of investigation into this story. I always thought that this was some kind of legend about the bumblebee. But not if you've heard this story before. Nobody's heard this story. Okay, in America, we have this story. So I did a bit of investigation to see if there was any truth to it, and in fact there is. So the story has its basis in a 1934 book by an entomologist, Antoine Magnan. When I discovered this, I actually went to one of our libraries at Harvard. We have the book, I have it in my office, and I read this very sentence from this book. He reports on an investigation with his colleague and mathematician, André Seplagu, who says, first prompted by what is done in aviation, I applied the laws of air resistance to insects, and I arrived at this conclusion that their flight is impossible. Now, why do I bring up this story? Because I see the same thing happening in open access journal publishing. Some people seem to think that in principle, open access publishing is impossible. It's as if they're saying, first prompted by what is done in business, I applied the laws of economics to open access journals, and I arrived at this conclusion that their sustainability is impossible. But of course, nobody told the open access publishers. So if we actually look, there are over 7,000 open access journals in existence today, according to the Directory of Open Access Journals. Now, this may sound like a large number, but it's only a small proportion of the tens of thousands of scholarly journals. And also, of these 7,000, many of these may be journals of perhaps not the highest quality. Nonetheless, the existence of high-quality, financially solvent open access journals is the best argument against the view that open access is impossible. We can argue about the principles, but we know that there are, in existence, several very large, successful open access publishers. Most prominently, Public Library of Science, I've talked about already, also Hindawi Publishing, Biomed Central, which is now a part of Springer, Springer Open, and so forth. There are now many of these. In fact, Public Library of Science's journal PLOS One, which I mentioned before, has seen incredible growth since it was established in 2006. It has grown to publishing almost 7,000 articles per year last year, making it arguably the single largest scholarly journal in the world. Not the largest open access journal, well, it is the largest open access journal, but the single largest scholarly journal of any sort in the world. It's been so successful, this one journal, PLOS One, that it has spawned a set of imitators. Several other publishers have picked up on this idea that PLOS pioneered of the kind of open access megajournal, and they've established their own open access megajournals. BMJ has BMJ Open, American Institute of Physics has AIP Advances, Nature Publishing Group now has their own open access mega journal. It's called Scientific Reports, covering all of science. Sage Publishing has a new mega journal called Sage Open. It covers all of the humanities and the social sciences. Genetics Society of America has G3, covering all of the life sciences. Cell Press, which is an imprint of Elsevier, has just launched a new journal of this sort, open access mega journal called Cell Reports. And you can see this list even includes publishers who in the past have been quite negative about the possibility of sustainable open access journal publishing in the past. So even those publishers seem to think that perhaps their previous arguments were not well-founded, that perhaps the bumblebee can fly after all. So open access journal publishing is possible, and in fact it's preferable in principle, but more importantly there's ample evidence that open access journal publishing is possible in practice as well, so long as the funders of research, that's the universities and funding agencies, are willing, as they should be, to underwrite reasonable open access publication fees on behalf of authors. Thank you very much.